I have a confession to make, and that is that I had a talk all planned for today, and I have scrapped it. I attended a cocktail party last night for the book festival, and a very nattily dressed gentleman came up to me, and he said, "I don't mean to be impertinent, but why you?" And I sort of hung my head, and he said, of all the American authors, there are two here for the book festival, and why you? And I was sort of taken aback. I thought, why me indeed? As a writer, you have to write with confidence. And I spend many, many hours in my little room with either a pen and paper in hand or a computer. And during those hours, I'm very confident. I know where I'm going, and I love going there. But creatively, I'm aware there will always be better writers out there than I, and that I just do the best I can and do what I can, and knowing that there will always be better writers and people selling more than me can get a little depressing. I try to do my best, and sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I don't. So if I'd had more outward bravado, which sadly I lack, when he asked why you, I might have said, though a lesser-known author, I do have 12 million books in print. I have a half-dozen New York Times bestsellers, and a couple of them are #1 bestsellers. I have been told that I was the first person to teach creative writing in English at the university level in China. I taught at Fudan University from 2008 through 2009. I was the first Raymond Chandler Fulbright Fellow at Oxford University. I have my work, I'm honored to have my work translated into 22 languages, including traditional Chinese, on sale in 70 countries. I've adapted one of my novels for a 2-hour television program in the United States, and I've co-written a young reader's novel. I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow when I give a talk at 2 o'clock. That has now been adapted as a stage play and is going to open on Broadway in New York City in February. But honestly, there are a lot of writers who could give those credentials a long run for their money, and I would still come off as a pretty funky, cheap little author. So I didn't tread into those waters with this guy. I just held my breath, and I wondered to myself, how did I get here? And I don't mean by Air Canada, although we had a great trip in on Air Canada. But why am I standing up here? Who's responsible? And it occurred to me that as writers, we all stand on the shoulders of great writers. My heroes are Robert Louis Stevenson, Edgar Allan Poe, Rudyard Kipling, Harper Lee, Arthur Conan Doyle, John D. MacDonald, Dostoevsky, John le Carré, Robert Ludlum, Raymond Chandler, James Crumley. In part, the reason I'm up here is I've written 38 novels. And at 100,000 words each, that's 4 million published words. And I hope that most of the time those string together into a suspenseful and engaging story. I'm up here in part because I work endlessly. I spend about 75 hours a week in my office. When my family takes vacations, I work from 7 a.m. until 1 p.m., and then I join them in whatever fun they're having. While I'm here in Hong Kong, I've been up every morning at 5 and working until I've had some sort of duty to do for the book festival. But it still doesn't fully explain to me why me. Why am I up here? How did I arrive at this point? In part, it's because I have a wild and criminal mind. Some friends say if I didn't have my writing as a healthy outlet, they'd probably have locked me up by now. And there's some truth to that. As a 13-year-old kid, I honestly played James Bond. One night, I sneaked out of my house with a lot of equipment, and some friends and I went down to the shoreline where I donned a scuba tank and swam underwater over to the extension of a very long pier. And this pier was guarded by a very old man who sat at the front and kind of nodded off throughout the night. And I sneaked over there with fireworks. My friends and I got onto the dock, set up these fireworks, lit a cigarette for a fuse, got back in the water, swam back to shore. The cigarette burned down, set off all the fireworks, and this poor old guy, running all around the pier, and we were just laughing. It was probably 2 a.m. So I was a criminal. I also was fascinated by audio electronics, microphones, speakers, things like that. And I discovered at an early age that if you wired a speaker, it actually is a microphone. And so I bugged my own house. I had wires that none of my family knew about running all over the house, and I could listen in rooms all over my house. When I was 12 years old, I was a spy. But crime fiction is character-driven at its best. And I became quite a crime character. My mother tells stories of how, as a 10-year-old, I had figured out how to rob our local bank. And I was relaying to her these stories of how I could rob the bank and get away with it. I don't remember that so well, but it's also character-driven in that our lives are filled with secrets. I grew up in a very nice, comfortable neighborhood. And one evening, my family and I were out eating dinner on our patio. It was a beautiful evening, and our neighbor pulled out of her house in a very nice car. And this was a lane that you might go 10 or 15 kilometers an hour on, very slow and quiet. And she went 80 kilometers an hour out of her driveway, wheels spinning, and smashed head-on into a tree. It was a horrifying moment. And it turned out she was mentally disturbed. And as a child, I didn't know that about my neighbor. It was the mother of one of my dear friends, but she was not all right in her head. And it began me on a journey of realizing that people keep secrets. My father was an alcoholic. He was not a mean alcoholic. He was just sick. He just drank a lot. And I discovered this in one way at a big family event where something like 40 or 50 of us had come together at my house from all over the country. I found my father under our grand piano, drinking. He thought he was hiding, and he was just under the piano. And, it was like, Dad, what are you doing? Oh, nothing. It was like, you can't see me here. But, of course, I could see him there. We, as a family, attended our Independence Day in the city park. It was a, beautiful summer evening, fireworks exploding everywhere, thousands of people on their blankets. And my father had been drinking. I didn't know this. But he had, and he went to get the car, the family car, to pick us up, and he never returned. In his drunken stupor, he had forgotten where he had parked the car. And he was too embarrassed to come back and tell his family about this. So it was like a scene from a movie. The fireworks ended. One by one, people started leaving the park, 10 by 10, 100 by 100. And finally, in this park that had held 10,000 people, there were 4 people still standing there. My mother, my brother, my sister, and I, and no car. And we just stood there, and my mother was getting madder and madder because, of course, she knew her husband had been drinking and had probably gotten in the car and driven off somewhere, which was not the case. He was still wandering around looking for the car. But people have secrets, and these secrets become a part of our lives. Sometimes they make us, sometimes they ruin us. But at the heart of every piece of fiction are such secrets. As a lad of about 13, I woke up one night, and my cousins, my mother's sister's family, lived in the house next to us. And there were loud cries, terrifying cries in the night. And I heard my cousins galloping through the forest behind our house. They were big, brawny guys. And I came to find out, that what they discovered when they reached this house in the woods were 3 women without any clothes on. Their house had been robbed, and they'd been told to take all their clothes off and go out on the roof. They were told this so they wouldn't notify authorities with any kind of timeliness. And my cousins had gone out and sort of rescued them from this. But again, this was something that, as a young child, you don't think of crime happening a few doors away. And it, in fact, had happened a few doors away. So now it felt like, at least to me, I was getting more to the source of why me. Why was I up here? And it was because I have a warped mind. I came out of college and tried to be a rock musician. I played rock and roll for many years, not to very much success. And during this time, I discovered trade magazines. In the United States, if you're a plumber or a construction worker or a bank teller, there is a magazine published for you. And it turns out that as a writer, if you can write 2 or 3 coherent sentences, you will be hired by editors to write for these trade magazines. So I got various jobs writing for trade magazines. I wrote for Robotics World. I wrote for Log Home Journal about how to build a log home. And I wrote 80 articles for something called Tellervision, which was a trade magazine on how to be a better bank teller. I'd never been a bank teller, but I wrote 80 articles on how to be a good bank teller. I was all this time writing my fiction. I wrote 11 scripts for television, which never got produced, many, many drafts of all of those. I wrote a novel, which never sold. I wrote, I think, 6 drafts of that novel, meaning 2,000 or 3,000 pages of that novel, and it never sold. And then I wrote a second novel, and I had gotten an agent by this point, and I went through, I think, 4 drafts. So I had written about 2,000 pages of this book, and we sold it to a New York publisher. I was as excited as a person could ever be. I had been writing for 8.5 years, 6 to 8 hours a day, and never sold any fiction. It was a long road, and finally I was a published novelist, and I was just running around out of my mind. And then I got the phone call from my New York editor. And I was very excited about this. I went out and bought a new pad of paper and a fresh pen, and I was ready to take my furious notes about how I could improve my novel. And my New York editor called me. I was terrified. And he was very polite and said how he'd liked the book and this and that. And I said, well, you know, let's discuss the work I need to do on it. And he said, I only have 2 things that you need to do. I have 2 problems with the book. That's the premise and the ending, which is, of course, the entire book. So I had to start the book all over. I had written about 2,000 pages. I started with a new premise and a new ending and wrote another 4 drafts. I had written something in the area of 6,000 pages by the time that book was finally published. And I was paid about enough money to buy a microwave oven for these almost 3 years of work. My next couple books did okay. I sold the paperback rights, and I wrote a book about a mall. I thought that at the time in America, this is the late 80s, that a shopping mall in some ways represented our whole culture. And I wanted to write a crime novel set in a shopping mall. So I went up into Canada, into West Edmonton, Canada, which was then the largest shopping mall in the world. It had 700 stores in it, 114 restaurants, a 13-acre water park, and a triple-loop indoor roller coaster, all in this one mall. And I went sneaking around the mall because I've been a spy since I was 10 years old. And at the end of this, I had a meeting with the security, the head of security for the mall. And he said, "How are you enjoying yourself?" And I said, "I'm having a great time." And I started telling him about a few things that I'd been doing. And he said, "Oh, no, let me tell you." And he reached into his pocket and pulled out a little notebook. And he said, "At 3 p.m., you were at Judy's yarn shop asking Judy how she would blow up the mall." And I said, "Yes, I was there." Well, it turned out the minute I'd been asking people how to blow up the mall, they'd put a plainclothes person on me and been following me around for all the days I'd been in the mall. I thought I had fooled everyone. I had fooled no one. They had photos of me sneaking around backstage in the construction areas where I shouldn't be. I was in all sorts of trouble. He let me off the hook. But I realized I wasn't very good at all this stuff. A few years would go by, and I received a phone call from a prosecuting attorney, a person who tries cases in U.S. court. And he said that he had heard, he told me this story. And the story involved, they had had a case where a woman's body had floated ashore. And they had used some experts in the University of Washington's oceanography department to plot the journey that this body had taken in order to determine where it had gone in the water. And it had gone in under a bridge called Deception Pass Bridge. Piece by piece, they put together a very elaborate story of this woman's final few hours. It included the fact that she had been found under this bridge, but there was no bicycle, no car, no means for her to have gotten there. And she was 20-some miles from her home. She was dressed very scantily in a small camisole top and underwear. It didn't seem likely a woman would ask someone else for a ride dressed this way. So they invited in the boyfriend. And the boyfriend said that he had heard a car door shut at 2 in the morning, and that was the last time he had seen his girlfriend. They said, "Thank you very much for sharing," and had him sign a statement. And then they went back to the oceanographer and asked if he was able to determine a time the body had gone in the water. Deception Pass Bridge, where she'd been found, is over the fastest currents in North America. And indeed, had she gone in the water after 12 midnight, she would have gone a different direction than she actually went. So they knew she had gone in the water prior to midnight. And yet they had the boyfriend claiming he had seen her at 2 a.m., 2 hours after midnight. And they knew they had him in a lie. So they brought him to court and they tried him for the murder of this woman. And they used these oceanographic experts that they had contacted at the University of Washington. It turned out I was being told this story because the prosecuting attorney had been reading a book at the time that told a story about these subplots and currents and tracking a body, and it was my book, Undercurrents. And he was calling me to thank me and say if I hadn't read your fiction, we might never have caught this murderer. And I said, "What an honor. I'm always borrowing from the police, and now I've finally given back to the police." And he said, "Well, the reason I'm calling is the case has come up on appeal, which means the criminal has a chance to reverse the verdict. And your name and your book was mentioned throughout the trial. So should he win on appeal," and he just left it hanging, and I went, "Should he win on appeal, I would be a dead man." Thankfully, he did not win on appeal. He stayed in jail. But the success of that book, Undercurrents, made me a bestseller. I had been a very poor seller up till then. And now suddenly I was a big international bestseller, and that meant I had bigger book tours, I had more publicity, more promotion for my work, including national book tours. And what happens on book tours, if you go into San Francisco or Seattle or Los Angeles, you're met at the airport by a publicity person that is hired by the publisher to sort of shepherd you around and make sure you show up in the right place at the right time. And year after year, you're usually with the same book person in each of these towns. In the case of San Francisco, the person who tours you around was also a musician. So we had something in common. And after many years of being traveled by her in and around the San Francisco area, I received a fax from her. And she said, "Would you volunteer to be in a band of authors? I don't know who's going to be into it. I'm going to put it together, and I'd like you to fly yourself to Los Angeles, and we'll have a good time." And I said, "I would love to play bass guitar." And so I was going to be the bass guitarist in this band. And about 3 weeks passed. And she contacted me again and said, "Okay, I have the band set. And here are the members of your band. Stephen King, who's one of the world's biggest best-selling authors, Amy Tan, another big best-selling author, Barbara Kingsolver, another big best-selling author, Dave Barry, a Pulitzer Prize-winning humorist, and you." And I about fell out of my chair. Me? With these people? So we put this band together. We played in front of 1,000 people. We made total fools of ourselves. We are the worst band that has ever happened. We play 50s and 60s rock and roll as badly as it happens. We are pathetic. But as we came off stage that night, Stephen King looked over his shoulder at me and he said, "Ridley, that was way too much fun. We're not done here." And in fact, we've now been playing 19 years. 2012 will mark our 20th year. We've raised over $2 million US for nonprofits in playing. We never get anything for this. People pay money to come see us be that bad. But what's been amazing is to observe the kind of fame that Stephen King has. I often, at these kind of talks, one of the first questions people ask is, what's Stephen King really like? So I'm just going to put that to rest. He's a 63-year-old, goofy 17-year-old guy. He's very funny. He's very, very smart. And he's not at all the sort of macabre, ghoulish person you would think he is from his writing. What's interesting about Stephen is his fans, because they are all psychopaths. And I include myself in that, because I'm a big Stephen King fan. I want to give you one example of this. We were playing a show in Nashville in a bar that holds about 1,000 people. It was a low ceiling, sawdust on the floor. We were up on this smoky stage playing our terrible music very poorly. And we went to close the night. We always close the night with Stephen because he's the big shot in the band. And he was up singing a teenage death anthem that he'd rewritten the words to. That's usually what Steve does. And it got to the very end, and somebody lit a lighter. And somebody else held up their cell phone, and somebody else lit a lighter, and another cell phone. And for our lousy rock band, we had that Bob Dylan thing going of everybody swaying and wanting an encore for our crazy band. We never got encores. And I looked down in front of Stephen, and there's a perfectly normal-looking 35, 40-year-old blonde woman, and she's standing, Steve's up onto the stage, she's down here, and she's looking up at him like this. All 10 fingernails on fire. Flaming fingernails. Let's hope they were plastic. And I went running over to Dave Barry playing my bass and shouted over the noise of our band, "I never want to be that famous." And I've never become that famous. But I met this great guy, Dave Barry, and we became friends that way. He's a delightful, delightful man. He's a humorist. So every week for 30 years, he had to be funny on paper. He was published at his peak, he was published in 550 publications worldwide every week. And he and I became fast friends through this band. We loved playing music together. We vacationed together. Our families spent time together. And when I and my wife had moved to St. Louis, Missouri, in the middle of the country, and our kids began to get older, we were reading to them every night, as I hope good parents do. And one night, when our 5-year-old was in need of her reading hour, I was sitting with her. She's now 14. And she was on my lap, and I was reading Peter Pan to her. And she looked up into my eyes, and she said, "Dad, how did Peter meet Captain Hook in the first place?" And this light went off in my head. And I went, oh, because in the great classic, we never learn how the boy can fly, why he never grows old, who the little personal assistant is. Where did she come from? How did he meet Captain Hook? My daughter's question. There were all these unanswered questions about how a young boy became Peter Pan in the first place. And I said to her, my daughter is named Paige, and I said, "Paige, that's its own story." And then I said, no, that's its own book, and Daddy is going to write the book. And I just left her there to look at the pictures, and I took off to my office and started making notes. About a week later, I was performing with this crazy band in Miami, and I was staying with Dave Barry, and I mentioned that I was thinking about writing a prequel to Peter Pan. And his eyes kind of went wide. And I said, "You know, Dave, I kill people for a living. I'm a crime writer. And you write booger jokes for a living. Maybe if we combined this funny with suspense, we could write for children. And we could write together." And he said, "I'm in." And we decided we would collaborate. And we wrote a story called Peter and the Starcatchers. And I'm going to talk more about Peter and the Starcatchers and the Kingdom Keepers at my talk tomorrow, which is at 2 p.m. But the fun part of Peter and the Starcatchers, which is now a 5-book series, is Disney, who is our publisher, got a hold of the first book and decided to make a stage play out of it. And after 4 years of development, this year the stage play opened what's called Off-Broadway in New York, a very small theater, maybe 150 seats, very minimal production. But it was very well received. And Disney has just told us in the last week or two that that same stage play is now going to move to Broadway in New York in February of this year. So it's been a very exciting few months for us. So for the curious of heart, my inquisitor at the cocktail party implied I was chosen because other American authors had already filled out their summer plans. And that obviously I had not, and therefore, since I was available, I would do the gig. But in fact, I am here because my country asked me to come. The Department of State called me and asked if I would partake in the Hong Kong Book Festival, and I was so delighted and thrilled. We had lived for a year in Shanghai when I taught at Fudan. We have only the greatest respect for American consulates and embassies, which help Americans out every day of the week, and I said I would be delighted to be here. So why me? The question will likely drive my insecurities for years and probably haunt me. But in the end, I think it was right on the tip of my tongue all along. I'm here because I work very hard. I have been extremely lucky and blessed. And I know the right people, and the right people apparently know me. So maybe my best answer to him would have been, why not? Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And I believe, is Chip here?
He's actually coming right now.
Chip is coming right now. I think Chip and I are going to sit and talk. If you have a question or two, I'd love to take them.
Would there be any questions from the floor?
Yes. I will repeat it.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Right. When you write stories, do you prefer to plan them or do you prefer to respond?
That's a great question. There are really two kinds of fiction writers. There are those that outline, and there are those that don't. Dave Barry, being a journalist, does not outline. And when we agreed to work together, it was a word he had to look up in the dictionary. But I wasn't going to write without outlining. I always outline, sometimes to my detriment, I suppose, but I want to know the end so I know where I'm going. There are authors everywhere that claim they don't outline, but when I talk to them, they will say, I don't outline, but I do think about my story for 3 months before I write it. And to me, that's a mental outline. I have such a bad memory, I write mine down. But there are other authors that start a book having no clue where it's going to go, how it's going to end, who's going to be in it. And I admire the heck out of that. And some of them, Stephen King, I mean, there are very successful authors who work that way. I am not one of them, mainly because I work on deadline, I work on projects, and I like to know where I'm going. The joy is by knowing where I'm going, then I can have a fun time going there.
Another question, maybe?
Yes.
Because I learned that you wrote mainly two types, crime story and testing, and children's fiction, right? Which one of the two genre you enjoy more?
A trick question. Which do I enjoy more, crime fiction or children's fiction? I enjoy them both. I mean, I think that's the safest, honest answer. They're very different in one way, in that the adult novels are more complicated and usually, but this is now proven inaccurate, more researched. The children's books are much more fun to publish. Children are a great audience. Dave Barry and I alone, I also write a series called The Kingdom Keepers and another called Steel Trap on my own. When you speak to children, they don't care about the movie rights. They don't care if the J.M. Barrie estate had any problem with us writing the books. They just want to know story and character. They want to know, will the crocodile get off the island? We had a child once ask us, what do they eat while they're on the island? In our novel, we had to come up, in the children's novel, Peter and the Starcatchers, we had to come up with a name for the character that would become Captain Hook, because Peter cuts off his hand. We couldn't call him Captain Hand. We had to think, and we thought, you know, there's Black Beard. What if ours was the Black Mustache? We would call our villainous pirate the Black Mustache. And so a child raised his hand and said, what did they call him when he was a child? We had no answer for that. There's just nothing more fun than speaking to a group of kids and seeing their enthusiasm for reading and their excitement about your stories. There is the other question I get along these lines is, it must be so different writing for kids than writing for adults. And honestly, it's not. I think that any piece of fiction that I write has to have characters that engage you and a story that engages you. And in this way, all fiction is the same. My children's novels differ from my adult novels really in the way you might rate a film, in that my adult novels would be more R-rated in the United States. They might have sex and more violence in them. The children's novels certainly won't have that. My adult novels might have more profanity in them. Certainly my children's novels would never have that. But at their core, at their heart, hopefully, they're fun, engaging stories, and in that way, they're really no different. And believe me, they are just as difficult to write. Yes?
Thank you, Mr. Pearson. Thank you for sharing with us your journey. It's very inspiring. I mean, you sort of struggled for many years being an unknown writer, and now you're famous. I want to know what inspires you to write. You know, what's the thing you get up every morning and you keep writing? Thank you.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of people will talk about writer's block. And I'm blessed in that I don't have writer's block. I have too many ideas. And I love what I do. And I really believe being an author, a published writer, is a privilege. It's something you need to earn on a daily basis. There are millions of people who would like to be a published author. And if you're lucky enough to be one, I don't believe my time should be spent on the golf course or at a volleyball net or at a resort. I think I should get up in the morning and write. And so I do. Whether or not I'm on that day or not, I sit down and I write because I believe writing is a process. And for me, the process involves a great deal of rewriting. I nearly always write 4 full drafts of my books. So a 400-page book, I've written 1,600 pages to make it work. And if I'm having a bad day, I still write that day because I will rewrite it at some point and hopefully improve it. But I'm a born storyteller. I love telling stories. And if I wait to write next month and don't write this month, then I'm never going to get to that 9th story I want to tell. So I work every day so that I can just keep telling stories. And as I say, I've got hundreds of stories I still hope I have a chance to tell.
Another question from this lady up here.
Did you read crime novels when you were a kid? You said you had a criminal mind since you've been a child.
That's a great question. I'm sure, I read in America there's a series of books called The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, and I do remember reading those. But I read historical fiction as a child. That's really what excited me. And when I was a teenager, about in maybe even my early 20s, I read the collective work of Arthur Conan Doyle. And that changed my writing forever, because he wrote forensics novels before there was CSI or any of these forensics. And it caught my eye that he would notice mud on a person's boot or the way a cane was carved. And I thought, this is back in the mid-'80s. And I thought, forensics are amazing. And I started talking to police about it. No forensics novels had been written at that point, and I started writing them. Patricia Cornwell came 3 or 4 years after my forensics novels. She did much, much better than I did. But it fascinated me. So during this year that I was lucky enough to be awarded the Raymond Chandler Fulbright at Oxford, I was roaming the shelves on Broad Street of a very famous bookstore, and I saw Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And I always thought, you had to be much smarter than I in order to read Dostoevsky. But I turned it over and it said, perhaps the greatest thriller ever written. And I thought, well, I write thrillers, I'd better read this. And I ended up reading everything he'd ever written, because it was just simply brilliant. And I realized Russian literature was accessible. I could read it. So, at every phase of my life, there's been another writer that's influenced me in a great way. But not particularly crime novels at the age of 10 or 12.
Would you consider writing such novels for kids?
Yes. Yes, I think I would. And to a degree, my Steel Trap series, there are 2 books, which are about a 13 or 14-year-old boy with a photographic memory. And he ends up embroiled in these crimes, and he can't forget them. So he becomes a very important witness or a participant on the side of good. I've never written sort of a whodunit like a Hardy Boys for youth, and I would love to do that. That would be an exciting project. I get hooked by exciting projects.
Thank you for all your questions. We are also very grateful to have a special guest, Mr. Chip Chow, on stage to chat with Mr. Pearson on the writing experience.
Hello, sir.
My apology. Well, the reason for this being awkwardly late is I have to make a bit of an announcement because I had to rush to do a TV promotion recording for Mr. Pearson's book, right? The TV booking was at 5 o'clock, but unfortunately due to, well, unsurprising bureaucratic reasons, they messed up their studio booking time a little bit. So I just finished doing a recording, holding a few of Mr. Pearson's books, with these alluringly beautiful covers, right?
Well, thank you.
And the program will be broadcast, say, between 7:15 to 7:30 on ATV Chinese channel on Saturday.
Well, thank you for doing
Terribly
that.
sorry about that.
No, I appreciate it.
Now, I do have a few questions to ask
Yes.
you, right? I mean, there's a strange way about American storytelling. I mean, your writing, right? The storytelling technique is so visually vivid. Right? And it reminds me from time to time, great traditions like Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and that sort of stuff.
I think we are a very visual culture, and I think that as there's been a progression in especially in commercial fiction that movies have pushed us toward,
And comic strip.
And television, because everything is so visual. I think we tend to write more visually. I'm a very visual writer. When I write, I see the scene. I am completely in the scene, and I describe to you what I'm seeing. And that's really how I approach it. I've often said that being a writer is in part being an actor, because you have to be able to get inside the head of all your characters or they won't be believable. They will be cardboard and superficial. So if it's a beautiful woman, I have to be the beautiful woman. If it's a crazy maniacal killer, I have to be the crazy maniacal killer.
So, well, there are also very few American thriller writers.
Yes.
Who have chosen to live in a place like Shanghai for a couple of years. Right?
Yes.
And I have been told recently, with alarm, that you are going to write a book on some sexual scandals, that sort of dodgy things, in Shanghai. Now, I start getting a little bit worried. Because
as you should, and the rumors are correct.
Given the freedom of the press and freedom of expression even in the West, there has occasionally been someone like Rupert Murdoch who has infamously refused the publication of our former governor, Chris Patten, about his memoir, on his Hong Kong experiences. And he has also fired a very outspoken so-called anti-communist, but formerly a very liberal journalist called Jonathan Mirsky. So can I wish you the best of luck with the publication of that notorious book if you are hatching such a plot?
I am hatching such a plot. I've just spent 2 years finishing a thriller that's set in Shanghai. It's about a kidnapping there. And it's interesting you bring this up, Chip, because we are right now in the process of selling it to film. And we've had several film studios refuse to even look at it because of its portrayal of China. They want to be in the good graces of China, and they said, if we made a movie about this book, China would never talk to us again. So I'm not sure I'll ever get the book published over here, but I've had a really terrifically fun time writing it.
So how far have you gone? How far have you gone with the writing?
I push it pretty far.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's there are a number of corrupt individuals,
Oh my God.
and there are a number of wonderful individuals, and it's a mixture of all of that.
You make me sweat. But I do look forward to reading it.
Thank you.
It sounds very, very, I feel very itchy about, turning the first page. Right? And I hope after you finish that book, next time you go to the Chinese embassy in Chicago or New York, you're applying for a travel visa, you'll get a friendly face.
Yeah. I hope I get
That's
in.
my hope, right?
Yes.
Because usually the troubles start there.
Yes.
Mr. Ridley.
Mr.
We
Pearson
know
again.
you. We know you. We've just, been reading a very, very interesting novel you've written, right? I mean, we've been calling you a dear friend of the Chinese people. However, right? Well,
No entry.
No, you're still welcome. You'll still be welcome, I'm sure, But after you land in Shanghai, within the 72 hours, you may find your mobile phone, sounding with a bit of a strange buzz or echo. Some slight technical problems.
I hope not.
Negligible, right? So, your novels, right? Now, do you believe in inspiration? Right? Is that is writing a very strong emotional impulse for you? Or you are a rational man, right? You write for children. You have to carefully design the plot and the language and the characters, right? For commercial reasons, at least for your teenage readers.
Yes, but I never write down to children. It's, I think, a great mistake. Children are much smarter than we think they are.
I think they are, yes.
And if you intentionally write down, they will sniff that out and throw your book across the room. And in fact, I would advise to never do that. They're far smarter than a lot of my adult readers. So if a child has to look up a word, then look it up. But I don't think you can pull punches with children. I think you can keep the story clean, but you don't simplify, and you don't try to simplify the writing. For one thing, I think you have to write the way you feel. And if you start trying to think about the reader, you will write incorrectly. I think you have to write, the way you feel it and the way
your
you
true
want
self.
it.
The liberation of your true self. Right?
Yes.
But fortunately, most of the American ego, right, is rather linked up with innocence. You look at Steven Spielberg's films or movies, stuff like Indiana Jones.
Yes.
Right? Steven Spielberg's are either blockbusters or classics, with the exception of perhaps like Schindler's List.
Yes.
Always shines with a timeless glamour of childhood.
Yes.
Of innocence.
And it is of innocence, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, he's in his mid-60s, and you can see his boss smile, right? He smiles like a kid. Right?
Yes.
I mean, so do you.
Yeah. I'm a kid at heart.
I mean, the English novel, the difference between English novels and American novels, I would say, is the English so-called sophisticated subtlety and the eternal American innocence and purity.
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting distinction. I think you're right.
I mean, look, Mark Twain, a humorist, but compared with Oscar Wilde, also an English humorist, you see the difference.
Yes.
Right? The first American novel I ever read was Huckleberry Finn. Right?
Ah, yes.
The nigger, the tiny nigger, now widely considered as something like politically incorrect, right? The river of Mississippi. Right?
Yes, that's where I live.
Right? It's
St.
where you
Louis,
live, right?
Yes.
I think some of the best American novels have got something to do with journey, right?
Yes.
Cowboys, right?
Yes.
Exploration of the West, either along a road, a superhighway, or the Mississippi River.
Yes.
Right? Search is the eternal theme, right? I
Yes.
think, under the impulse of ancient impulse of Columbus, search, cross the ocean, go to the other shore of the river, and see what the hell's going on there.
And the British write about search for self.
They do. Well, from Robinson Crusoe, right?
Yes.
Search, and to Mark Twain's great stuff. But your novel, I mean, it's got most of them have got very, powerful. Well, this is a bit of a problem in Hong Kong. What they call property hegemony, right? Because there's always going on, and would you tell the TDC boss, right, to get this annoying noise to stop, right? Otherwise, Mr. Ridley Pearson is going to boycott the next session.
Monsters in my head.
Wow, yes,
I didn't know that was
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the premises close to the CEC, but I hope this will become another inspiration for Mr. Pearson.
I'm working it into a book as we
We are
speak.
only joking. You don't have to be so bureaucratically serious about this. Right? I mean, your opening paragraph. I've read enough books like the first few lines, about thriller book, about detective stories, the first paragraph or the first few lines are so visually striking. The tired old carriage pulled by two tired old horses, right? Tired old, you use it twice,
yes,
right? Nice repetition. Rumbled onto the wharf is creaky wheels bumping on the uneven planks. Now, when I read a good book, I always put myself into the writer's shoe. Right? I tend to think now, had it been me, how could I have written it? I would have put it like the tired carriage pulled by two old horses. Right? I rumble onto the wharf is wheels bumping. But you just, tighten the screw to such an extent that you never waste any space. So instead of just saying it's wheels, rolling on the uneven planks, you say it's creaky wheels bumping on the uneven planks. Now that is the difference. That is the difference between a professional writer and, a mediocre counterpart like me.
I doubt that. But thank you.
But very visual. Very visual.
Yes, very visual.
Why waste a single inch of space? Right? Make it visual. Make it visualize. Make it, something that can be seen on the cinema screen. Right? Waking Peter from his restless slumber. When I put myself into your shoes, I wouldn't have used the word slumber. It sounds a little bit too literary, but it fits into the context. I would have used something like sleep, because we have been told by our Hong Kong teachers, use simple English.
Simple, yeah.
Right? Slumber is a little bit poetic, right? But restless, you add an adjective there, which makes it, you never waste, right?
I'm starting to think I should edit this.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's overwrite, but you call it overwriting.
Yes, I hope it's not overwriting.
No.
Because I actually don't care for overwriting.
Right? The carriage interior, hot and stuffy, smelled of 5 smallish boys and 1 largest man, none of whom was keen on bathing. Now, smallish and largest. Right? Why smallish and largest? Why you can use small and large, right?
Yeah.
So these are the tiny things, right?
Yes, you're right.
The tiny creaks, here and there, you can fill them up with imagination, with color, or even with smell. Hot and stuffy. Amazing, right?
Well, you always
it's just like watching a 3D movie.
You always want to touch on all the senses.
Exactly.
Yes?
All the senses. Make full use of your description.
What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you see?
Maximize whatever dramatic effect that can be expressed through the very, through your nib, the nib of your pen, right? Or your keyboard. That's the magic.
But you're also right in that if it was Ernest Hemingway, he would have said, the carriage arrived, the kids were tired.
That's right, yes. So that's
great.
Miraculously, that's the next question I'd like to ask you. I mean, compared with Hemingway, his damn plain, right?
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah.
Right? Short
Yeah,
sentences.
but beautifully simple.
Beautiful. Well, it looks like to me the difference between a color picture and black and white.
Yes. No, it's very good.
Monochrome, right? Drawing between paintings and drawing.
Yes.
A different style. Right? But in Hong Kong, we could get a little bit confused if we, as school children, have been indoctrinated solely with the writing of Ernest Hemingway. We tend to think that it is her only Hemingway that represents the correct style of writing.
Speaking of inspiration, do you know the painter Seurat? Do you know this painter? Writes with little dots.
Seurat, yeah.
Seurat?
Post-impressionist.
Yeah, post-impressionist.
Right?
Yeah. I went to an art exhibit.
Tiny dots. Sometimes, you know, when I was very young, I thought these dots, you know, they're absolutely irritating.
But I went to an art exhibit in Paris many years ago, and it was only 4 of his works. But they had 100 or more pieces that he prepared each work with. It was all his studies. And as a writer, I found it incredibly inspiring, because it was the first time I realized that, you know, the finished work is one thing, but the preparation to the finished work is so important and so critical that a person like Seurat would do 100 pieces to get a single piece done. And so when I start a book, I write what we call a Bible. I write a little book about each character. I write a little book about each location that will be in the book, so that I'm very aware of my surroundings. I'm aware of the smells. I'm aware of the sounds. I'm aware of what somebody likes to eat, even if I never show that person in a dining situation. It separates them in my mind one from another. And you had mentioned inspiration, and I find things like this, like visual art, very, very inspiring.
Do you sort of go back, you know, get into the second or third writing to fill these holes?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Or
usually to take,
it just flows out easily?
Oh, no. I go back and back and back, and it's usually to make it tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter.
Yeah.
I write too much, and then I suck it out.
Right.
And
Thank you.
But maybe it's still too much.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So for those lucky ones, you know, who have attended this session, right, behind the door professional training on writing, right? So I have been warned by our host, you know, we're running out of time, so we better leave some time for readers and audience to queue up for some autographs.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Pearson and Mr. Chow. For those who are interested in Mr. Pearson's work, we have a very limited number of copies available outside. More copies are available at the English Avenue in Hall 1C downstairs. Also, for those who haven't got a copy of Mr. Pearson's work for his autograph, we have a little souvenir for you, which is a photo, so that you can have it signed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Pearson, well, we've got another session, right, on Saturday?
Yes.
On Saturday. Tomorrow, okay. So, I mean, do come back and we'll touch on a range of different topics.
Yes.
You know, it's limitless, endless American literature, and I'm going to ask you how some T.S. Eliot's poetry could have some influence on your novels. You know, I know you've never thought about that, you know. That's the problem with critics, right? Over-interpretation, right? Thank you.